Of jobs could be lost at South African Airways as it embarks on a restructuring process. Unions have accused the airline of not consulting them about this restructuring. But SAA has hit back, saying that unions did not attend a meeting that was meant to discuss the restructuring and job cuts on Monday. Now, the national carrier says that restructuring process is necessary for the survival of the airline. SAA spokesperson Tlali Tlali declined our offer to come to the show this morning due to other commitments in Parliament. But joining us now is NUMSA's national spokesperson Phakamile Hlubi-Majola. Thanks so much for coming through. So, firstly, let's start here. Is it correct that the unions have promised the mother of all strikes should this restructuring process go through?
Well, I think first and all, let me just clarify you a little bit, because there's two processes at play, right? We've currently been engaged in wage talks with SAA. In fact, we deadlocked with them a couple of weeks ago because we obviously tabled our demands and they responded with 0%. If we embark on strike action, it will be over the demand for wages, because that is the certificate which we have obtained. In relation to the restructuring, this was something that actually caught us by surprise, actually, because particularly when we say that, we're talking about the fact that them serving us with Section 189 this week. We're saying this because we actually met with South African Airways management on Monday, earlier in the day, to discuss wages. And in that discussion, there was no mention of the fact that they intended to serve us with Section 189. There was no discussion about the fact that there would be plans to retrench workers. So we had that meeting. The meeting ended. People went their different directions. Much later on in the afternoon, around 5 p.m., SAA started calling trade unions frantically, demanding that they come to a meeting, a hastily scheduled meeting. And of course, nobody pitched, because, I mean, you're calling us at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We had met earlier. If you'd wanted to say what you wanted to say, you would have said it surely at that forum. And we were saying, let's have schedule another meeting. So unfortunately, we were unable to make it. For them, they consider that consultation, which of course is absolute nonsense, and we reject that. And that's why we say that we were not consulted, because after that, they then issued the statement. And in their statement, they then claimed that they consulted us when clearly they had not.
So the airline also claims that it has commenced consultation with all employees. Are you aware of that?
Well, obviously, as part of a process of Section 189, we must have consultations. That's how the process works. So we are just waiting for more details in terms of when we will have more meetings with management in relation to this process and how it will unfold. For us, though, I think it's very important that members of the public must understand that, you know, workers at SAA have been the ones that have been at the forefront of actually trying to save this airline. Workers have been the ones that have been committed to this airline. Workers have been the ones that have exposed corruption at the airline and have been fighting to root it out. But we've not seen that commitment from the management of SAA, and certainly not from the board. It's been very clear to us that the agenda from the beginning has been to collapse the airline so that they can privatize it.
Well, SAA contends that if they don't embark on this restructuring process, then the airline will collapse. They're saying that if they don't retrench these 944 workers, that all jobs at SAA will be on the line.
Where we have a disagreement with the management of SAA is the fact that we do not believe that they have tried absolutely everything. One of SAA's biggest problems is rampant looting and corruption. This airline has spent millions of rands on forensic investigations into corruption at the highest levels. There's been Ernst & Young reports, there's been an open waters investigation, and various other investigations. What I know is at least 9 forensic investigations. These forensic investigations talk about, if you look at, for example, Open Waters, which talks about corruption at South African Airways Technical, it's very specific. Talks about specific managers where action must be taken, managers who must be dismissed, managers who must be suspended, investigations, further investigations that must take place. SAA hasn't done a single thing to deal with corruption at the highest level. It's done nothing to recover millions of rands that were wasted through looting. NUMSA has had to go to court. We've gone to the High Court last year to force SAA to implement the recommendations of its forensic reports. In fact, SAA fought us. It even appealed the decision after we won in court. So we believe that the management of SAA is disingenuous. They're not genuine. They have had 8 turnaround strategies which they have failed to implement. And one of our consistent demands as unions has been that the board must be scrapped. Before we even talk about retrenchments, can we talk about what you have done to recover monies that were lost through looting? What have you done to implement a turnaround strategy? Frankly, this management and this executive management and the board of SAA has failed on all accounts. And as far as we're concerned, the plan to retrench workers and the threat to cut jobs is actually directed at unions for making those specific demands.
Your demand for, for SAA following through on the recommendations of its own reports and those findings, I think is valid. That notwithstanding, though, do you believe that there is a need for these retrenchments, whether it be the 944 that is currently on the table or perhaps fewer retrenchments? But do you believe that, SAA does need to reduce its headcount? Because they stated yesterday that 24% of their costs goes to labor. So what's your view in that regard? Do they need to retrench?
No, we do not think that they need to retrench. And I think when you say that 24% of its headcount, of its costs is labor, can we look at what are also the other costs? I think it's almost as if
27% goes to fuel.
To fuel,
that
for
means
example,
more than 50% on those two components.
Precisely, and in fact, it's fuel that's their highest cost driver. So, in other words, if you need to get to work, Sakina, you're not going to suddenly stop pouring petrol in your car, because otherwise that's going to stop you from being able to do your job. Cutting staff at SAA is not actually going to have the desired outcome. What they should be doing is dealing with the things that brought them to this point of crisis in the first place. This is something that SAA has failed to do.
What if they say that a bloated staff component is part of what got them to this point? Would you accept that?
No, we wouldn't accept that. We wouldn't accept that because, as I said, that we all know how we got here. We didn't get here because of staff. We got here because this is an airline which is failing to make money. And why is it failing to make money? Because it hasn't implemented a turnaround strategy. That turnaround strategy speaks directly to how this airline can generate revenue and become profitable. We had a group CEO a couple of months ago who had devised a very successful turnaround strategy. It was so successful that it was supported by the private sector. But because government failed to honor its obligations by providing funding for that turnaround strategy, that group CEO left out of frustration. That is at the heart of the crisis of SAA. Its failure to manage the airline and make it profitable. And
So how could they do that? As a union, of course, you have a vested interest in this because you want your members to remain employed. So how can they return this airline to profitability?
Implement the turnaround strategy. Implement the turnaround strategy.
Which turnaround strategy? Because they are saying part of that is this restructuring that they will be embarking on, which says, in part, we need to get rid of some people.
No, it's not. It's not just that. It's much more than the strategy does not speak only to retrenchment. The strategy speaks to how the airline can actually gain new clients, how the airline can become profitable. That is actually what the strategy speaks about. And unfortunately, they failed to implement that. Now, if you don't implement a strategy, of course, there's no money that's going to come into the airline. Now, workers must pay with their jobs because of the failures of executive management to do their work. Of course, as a union, we can never accept that. We know very well that the biggest part of South African Airways' problem is corruption. This board and management has demonstrated to us that they're not interested in rooting out corruption. When you look at, for example, you have an example at South African Airways Technical, the former acting CEO, Malola Phiri, according to the Open Waters report, was implicated in those reports, and there were allegations of corruption. No steps were taken against him. Malola Phiri right now is working at SAA Express. This is what we've seen from this management, from this executive management and the board at South African Airways. Is
so
a very
what exactly
consistent
are you
plan
accusing them of?
We are saying that they are protecting corruptors and looters. That's what we're saying. And they have been hesitant to deal with those people. They've not recovered a red cent from any person who's been accused of wasteful expenditure or deliberately robbing the airline. We'll give you another example. A couple of years ago, in 2015, South African Airways purchased ground power units. These are units that allow the airline to sort of charge itself. I'm sure you've seen planes when they're parking. They've got this thing that charges the plane so that it can, when they take off, it can continue. Now, there was a time when they purchased those. They owned about 5 of them, or 6 of them, if I'm not mistaken. And they purchased them at a cost of about 5 million rand. They went and sold them to JM. They sold them to another company at a third of what they were worth. And now they are renting the same GPUs from Swissport at 500 rands per hour. So now the question we have to ask ourselves, you had assets. You owned these assets. These assets were critical to your operation. You went through corruption, according to the Open Waters report. They believe that this transaction was corrupt and flawed, and sold it to another entity. Now you are renting those devices from another company. The Ernst & Young report talks about contracts, evergreen contracts that SAA has. It questions the cost of those contracts. It stipulates that some of these contracts, the amounts are bloated. The board doesn't want to deal with any of these contracts. But here we are discussing retrenchments and job losses of workers who had absolutely nothing to do with the crisis that SAA finds itself in.
So where to now from here? Because essentially you are charging that the board and the executive are, in a sense, delinquent when it comes to their fiduciary duties. So where to now for you?
We've said that as NUMSA. In fact, we've even lodged an application at the High Court to say the board is delinquent. And besides that, we've lodged, as you know, we've had many campaigns to say that the board should be scrapped because they have failed in their duties. And our demand remains that they must be removed. And this is why one of the reasons that we will be embarking on strike action, that will be one of our demands. We, as unions, certainly NUMSA and SACA are working together on this. We are mobilizing our members. We have received a strike certificate. Balloting has taken place. All that's left is for our members to give us a mandate in terms of when to embark on strike action.
And just a final question, how would you feel about SAA being placed under business rescue, if that were even an option at any point?
Well, I think that's something that we would certainly have to look at if it's an option that would save the airline and save jobs in the long run. For us, the main thing is that we believe that this airline can be saved. We believe that it can be profitable. What we have is a management and a board that is not committed to saving the airline.
Well, thank you so much for coming through. NUMSA's national spokesperson, Phakamile Hlubi-Majola, speaking to us about the impending retrenchments at SAA. Well, that brings us up to news time. Leanne standing by with that.